And then let me share my screen. All right. Play from start. So again, we want to welcome everyone to season 7 of Environmental Fridays. It is personal. You can see this is our link here to our website. This season 7, we have 15 episodes, about 16 guest speakers. One of the episodes would actually have 2 guest speakers, and that's actually coming up next week. I'll show you that. You could see our speakers come from a number of different places throughout the United States and the Caribbean. If you'd like to also get on our website, you could either use the link or the QR code at the bottom. For this month of October, today we will look at global warming and coral reef bleaching. So you'll hear some more about that. Next week, we'll have 2 speakers, Michael and Art, talking to us about future farm, net zero energy, sustainable agriculture. And then very interestingly too, is we will have the chief of First Peoples in Trinidad, but he has reached for First Peoples across the Caribbean. And that'll be really interesting to get into the environmental philosophy and practices of the First People. So that's what's coming up this month. One of the things that inspires me and inspires Environmental Fridays is this iconic photograph. Some refer to it as the most iconic photograph in human history. It's called Earthrise. Again, if you want to learn more about it, in fact, an interview of the astronaut Bill Anders, Apollo 8, took this photograph, and you could learn more and hear his interview by, again, looking at that QR code. So this is our blue planet, our home, and it's inspirational. In fact, um, it was one of the driving forces behind Earth Day and other environmental movements that came from it. So our environmental awareness and consciousness really grew by this photograph, iconic photograph. And so what we try to do in Environmental Fridays is address what the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, describes as the triple threats to Earth: pollution, climate change, and loss of biodiversity. Maybe today our speaker, Derek, would be more in the area of biodiversity, but there is, of course, overlap between all 3 of these threats. So one of my favorite poets, Emily Dickinson, wrote this poem that I think gives a sense of like, okay, we have environmental awareness, but now we also need to actually do something, environmental action. And it goes like, if I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one life the aching, or cool one pain, or help one fainting robin unto his nest again, I shall not live in vain. So we want in Environmental Fridays not just to become educated and aware of these problems, but for us to do something about it, to be proactive. And I think this poem by Emily Dickinson sort of captures that, at least I'm interpreting it in that way. All right. So Sarah, my co-host for today, we were just trying to figure out how long we've known each other, and it's somewhere around 2009, 2010. So it's been a while. We've known each other. She is a journalist, a scientist, an educator. She's specialized in science communication in different settings, including TV, radio, informal and formal, from preschool to college and beyond. She's in the nonprofit realm. Your organization, Renaissance Women Consulting, I believe, is a nonprofit that you got started recently. How recent was that?
It's actually an LLC, and I like to say that rather than baking bread during COVID, since
Mm-hmm.
I had just had an actual live baby, I decided to create my own business because, what
Yes,
else do you do when you're stuck home?
I know. A lot of stuff started during COVID. That is really cool. So, um, yeah, Sarah will be our co-host today. She's also been involved in STEM diversity, STEM engagement initiatives. And so she has a broad interest professionally and personally. And it's a pleasure to have her here being a co-host for us today. So Sarah, take it away.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Desmond. I was thrilled when I saw you put out the call for fellow co-hosts because, as I've mentioned on my social media, someday hosting a podcast is something that I would like to do. So this is a great way to get my feet a little bit wet. And when I was looking at the many different topics that you had coming up, this one particularly stood out to me because one of my past lives was a TV meteorologist. I have a degree in atmospheric and oceanic science from UW-Madison. And so having someone from NOAA coming and speaking, there is, like you said, so much connection between climate change, biodiversity, and then pollution is obviously leading to both of those other problems. So it was really great. And aligned with what I was interested in. So I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker for today, and that is Derek Menzello. He is a coral reef ecologist with a PhD in marine biology and fisheries from the Rosenthal School of the University of Miami. Dr. Menzello is a coordinator of NOAA's Coral Reef Watch program, an effort focused on monitoring of coral reef ecosystems through satellite observations. Coral Reef Watch is part of NOAA's NESDIS Center for Satellite Applications and Research and uses NOAA and international satellite data to monitor environmental conditions that lead to coral bleaching. From 2001 to 2021, Derek worked at NOAA's Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory in Miami, Florida, where he led the development and implementation of climate change and ocean acidification monitoring of the NOAA National Coral Reef Monitoring Program for U.S. coral reef ecosystems.
National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is what
Yes, thank you.
no.
NOAA. God, I love the jargon in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Dr. Menzello has published on multiple topics in coral reef ecology and regularly conducts research that spans the disciplines of biology, chemistry, and geology. Love that interdisciplinary work. His primary research interest is understanding the impact of climate change and ocean acidification to coral reef ecosystems. Dr. Menzello has conducted over 1,000 scientific dives while researching coral reefs in all U.S. coral reef jurisdictions, as well as international locations in the Pacific, including the Galapagos, Panama, French Polynesia, Fiji, Palau, Papua New Guinea, and Indian Ocean's Chagos Archipelago. So welcome, Derek. So excited to learn from you today.
All right. Okay, Derek, you could go ahead and upload your.
Thank you so much for that excellent introduction. If there are any issues during my talk, please, I guess, speak up because I can't see anybody. I'm just looking at my talk. Well, thank you so much again for the opportunity to present here today. Today, I'm going to introduce you to coral reefs in general, and also explain why coral reefs are considered the canaries in the coal mine of ocean ecosystems for climate change impacts. So what you're looking at here is essentially a heat stress, heat exposure map from the last year and 9 months. And by the end of this talk, I'm hoping that you'll be able to understand what this is showing you. So first, what is a coral reef? Well, in the simplest sense, it's a complex structure that's built by corals and other calcifying organisms. The key thing here is it's a wave-resistant three-dimensional structure that is built by the calcification and growth of the coral skeleton. So they're basically building the structure on which they live. And depending on where you are in the world, coral reefs can look very, very different. And again, this has to do with multiple different factors, but I just wanted to give you an idea of, how different reefs look in different parts of the world. So here we see coral reefs in Papua New Guinea, as well as the Chagos Archipelago in the Indian Ocean. There on the left is a coral reef in the Florida Keys. Now, unfortunately, most of the reefs in the Florida Keys don't look like this anymore, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But there are still a few patch reefs in certain locations in Florida where you can find decent abundances of certain corals. So here we're looking at, this is called the mountainous star coral. Species name is Orbicella faviolata. This species is threatened under the Endangered Species Act, but there are a few locations, a few refugia in Florida where you can still find these guys. Here on the right is a coral reef in Panama, where I spent a lot of time during my graduate work. Now, what's interesting about those reefs on the Pacific side of Panama is that you can tell those are essentially built by one species of coral. So these are buildups of, call them monospecific buildups of coral. And the reason for that is the Eastern Tropical Pacific is a very marginal environment for coral reef development, and it has a lot of highly variable environmental conditions that really limit the number of species that are there and how fast they grow and how fast they're accreting these reefs. Over there on the left, you see a picture of a reef in Fiji, and then on the right is a picture of a reef in the island of Saipan, which is in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. And the cool thing about that photo on the right is it shows that, during certain times of the year on certain reefs, you can get what are called low tide exposures. So, the ocean levels will essentially drop due to the tides. Again, the tides are due to the gravitational pull of primarily the moon, but also the sun as well. And you can get basically corals popping out of the ocean. And you'd be like, well, how do they survive? Well, corals have been around for hundreds of millions of years. So they are well adapted to survive natural disturbance events like low tide exposure. So what they do is they basically produce a ton of mucus. So they're basically covering themselves in snot so that they don't dry out and get harmed. And these low tide exposures usually only last, on the order of 30 minutes to an hour. In some places, like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, you can get low tide exposures like this on a daily basis. So why do we care about coral reefs, aside from the fact that they're, what I think are the most beautiful ecosystems on planet Earth? Well, they're biodiversity hotspots. They've been called the rainforests of the sea. It's estimated that about 550,000 to 1.3 million species live on coral reefs. And that's about 25% of every living thing in the world's oceans is associating with coral reefs at some point in their lives. One thing that is really, really important to people living near coral reefs is the coastal protection they provide from storms. So the often cited statistic is that, a healthy coral reef can attenuate about 97% of the wave energy during storms. So this is very important during things like hurricanes, right? They're also very important to fisheries. You can see a big giant Goliath grouper there. That's from Lou Key in the Florida Keys. Now that is a protected species as well because they were drastically overfished, but they have made a comeback since they've been protected, which is great. It's been estimated that coral reefs are contributing about $3.4 billion to the U.S. economy every year, and that's through things like tourism, scuba diving tourism, snorkeling tourism, but also the fact that they're providing this natural infrastructure in coastal protection from storms. So they're protecting property and people's homes, which contributes indirectly to the economy. Also, there are new pharmaceuticals being sourced from coral reefs. So some experimental cancer drugs are coming from coral reefs as well. So they have many, many benefits, even if you're landlocked and living in the Midwest, like where I grew up in Chicago, you still have benefits from coral reefs. So coral bleaching. So corals live in a symbiosis with a type of algae. Now, the coral animal itself is a very simple animal in terms of evolutionary development, right? It's only 4 cellular layers thick. And within one of those layers are these things they call them zooxanthellae. So these are algal symbionts. And these guys live in the gastrodermal tissues of the coral. And they provide upwards of about 95% of the nutritional requirements of the coral animal. So, this symbiosis is good for the corals because basically they're just sitting there sunning themselves and they're getting all their energy from these algae. And it's these algae that allow them to calcify rapidly, rapid enough to where they're accreting reef structures faster than they're ultimately eroded by physical erosion from storms, biological erosion, and chemical erosion. But the Achilles heel of the symbiosis is that it's highly sensitive to elevated temperatures. So when temperatures get too hot during the warmest time of the year, as little as 1 degree Celsius or 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit above what these corals normally experience on average during the warmest part of the year, you keep temperatures 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit above that for a month or more, and they're going to start bleaching, and they expel their algal symbionts. So essentially, the coral in a bleach state is basically starving to death, right? Because it's no longer getting all that nutrition. Now, corals do feed from the water column. They're all these little polyps, and they collect plankton and stuff. So some coral species can kind of hang on during bleaching events by feeding, but others, unfortunately, will rapidly perish. So the coral you're looking at here is, again, this is that mountainous star coral. It's threatened under the Endangered Species Act. This coral is living off the coast of Islamorada in the Florida Keys. Now, this coral is about 2 meters tall or 6 feet tall, so it's about the same height as me. And this species grows about 1 centimeter a year. So this coral's about 200 years old. So what that means is that this coral began its life off the coast of Islamorada 50 years before the American Civil War. So it's pretty crazy to think about that. So again, this kind of goes into the physiology 101. So the symbiotic algae are providing food to the corals. They're oxygenating its tissues, and they're also providing sunscreens via these things called mycosporine-like amino acids. So corals are sitting and experience some of the highest dosages of solar radiation of any ecosystem or animal or plant on planet Earth. So not only are these algae feeding the corals, they're actually providing them these sunscreens that block out ultraviolet radiation. So in turn, the coral's providing food to the algae via their waste products and their nutrients, carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, and they're also giving them a nice home, right? So it's the types of algae that live in corals. There's other species within that that algal phylum that live in the water column. So those ones that are living in the water column, they could be eaten by zooplankton and things like that. So these guys are basically given a nice little home to live in. But again, when you have high temperatures, you get a breakdown in that symbiosis, and they expel the algae again. So the thing to keep in mind is even when a coral bleaches, it's not dead, it's still alive, right? And it can recover if temperatures cool off quick enough, and then it's able to regain its algal populations. Now, again, bleaching is not a death sentence, but it does come with a cost. So corals experience a physiological hangover for upwards of about 5 years after they bleach. So they have depressed growth rates for 2 to 4 years, impaired reproduction for 4 to 5 years. And then the big issue in the Caribbean is they become susceptible to disease for upwards of 2 years after a bleaching event. Now, I'll touch on that later in the talk. So again, the issue here is if you lose enough coral on your reef's basically going to go from an accretional, architecturally complex, three-dimensional structure to one that's erosional and becoming flattened over time. So some of the reefs in the Caribbean and Florida these days kind of look like parking lots because they've lost a lot of their three-dimensional structure. And the issue here is it's that three-dimensional structure and habitat complexity that biodiversity is really depending on, right? So you can think of an analogy to an old growth forest. So, you walk through there, there's certain plants and animals that only live on the dead wood. There's certain plants and animals that live in the soil and the leaf litter and, in the canopy, in the trees. But if you chop down that forest, you're left with basically some kind of grass or something will pop back up and you're going to have very, very low biodiversity. So it's a similar analogy to a coral reef in that the corals, just like the trees, are the ecosystem engineers for that entire ecosystem. So if you kill off enough corals, you're basically eliminating an entire ecosystem. So what does this mean? Well, there are some animals that are totally dependent on corals, living corals, for their survival. So there are things called corallivores. Now, a corallivore is an animal that eats coral tissue, so live coral tissue. So corals die, they're losing their food source. That's not a good thing to have happen. So in the top left there, you see a guinea fowl pufferfish in the Indian Ocean. Now this guy eats coral as one of his primary sources of his nutrition. Again, so if the coral dies, he basically is going to lose a large part of his diet and suffer as a result. So all of these other things you're seeing here, these crazy looking shrimps and crabs, these are all called coral obligates because they're depending on live corals for their survival. And some of these guys have developed really, really neat symbioses with the corals. So that image there in the bottom middle with that crab with the little spots on it, that's called a crustacean guard. And that's in the genus Trapezia. And this crab has developed a symbiotic relationship with corals because it lives within the branches and it protects the corals from a type of starfish that feeds on the corals. So in certain places in the Pacific Ocean, you get outbreaks of these things called crown of thorns starfish, and they can decimate entire reef areas. Well, these crabs can basically use olfaction to smell them in the water, and they know they're coming up onto their coral, and they'll crawl out to the branch tips, and they'll basically start snipping and biting at the crown of thorns starfish and clipping off its 2 feet. And eventually the starfish will be like, I'm going to go to a different coral. So there's a symbiosis between this crab and the coral, because the crab is feeding on fat bodies that the coral produces, and in turn, the coral doesn't get eaten by the crown of thorns starfish. So when corals die, these crabs, unfortunately, also will die as well because they don't have their home anymore, essentially. So clownfish, corals are not the only thing that bleach on reefs. So clownfish or Nemo, these guys live in a symbiotic mutualism with these anemones. So what that means is that they're able to coat themselves in this mucus of the anemone so the anemone does not recognize them as a foreign object. And the reason they do this is it provides them protection from predation or protection from being eaten, right? So when you see these guys on the reef, they're constantly ducking in and out of these anemones. Again, because they're basically doing that to avoid being eaten. Well, the issue is these anemones live in a symbiotic relationship with a type of algal symbiont, just like the corals, and they're also highly sensitive to temperature. So these anemones are actually basically an indicator species for when you have a bleaching event, because these are some of the first things that'll bleach. So the issue is if these anemones die from bleaching, Nemo is not going to have a home anymore, and basically he's probably going to get eaten pretty fast because these guys are incredibly conspicuous on the reef. I mean, you can't miss them. So again, there's all these impacts happening on coral reefs, and it doesn't just include the ecosystem engineering corals. It also includes these very charismatic, plants and animals that many, many people have grown to love. So the future for coral reefs is not promising. And the reason I say that is because it's based on the current climate projections. It's estimated that coral reefs are basically going to start bleaching every year severely, beginning sometime between the years 2040 and 2050. So in the next 20 to 30 years, we could be living on a planet where the oceans get so warm that corals are experiencing severe bleaching on an annual basis. Now, the issue here is if it takes 5 years for a coral to recover from one bleaching event, and then you start bleaching them every year, you're basically going to have corals that are in a state of chronic stress. And again, they're likely going to perish just from disease and things like that because they can become immunocompromised by the bleaching stress. So again, the prognosis for coral reefs is not promising because the oceans are continuing to warm quite rapidly, and it's causing these bleaching events to increase in severity, frequency, and scale, as we're going to see now. Now, to take you back, as I said earlier, coral reefs have been considered the canaries in the coal mine. Well, the canaries started dying 41 years ago already, if you can believe it. So the first mass coral bleaching event due to elevated sea surface temperatures occurred in the eastern tropical Pacific during the El Nino event of 1982-83. Now, this is the first time a large-scale heat-driven bleaching event occurred. Now, coral bleaching as a phenomenon was known for over 100 years before this, right? So basically, any stress you hit a coral with is going to make it bleach. So if it experiences low salinity water, water that doesn't have enough salt content, it'll bleach. If you cover it with sand or sediment, it'll bleach. If you hit it with too much light, it'll bleach. So corals are very, very sensitive to environmental change. But the issue is, it was never observed before to see reefs bleaching over huge areas, like entire countries and entire ocean basins, right? The first mass bleaching event that was documented occurred in Jamaica in the early 1960s. And again, this was due to a hurricane. The hurricane dumped a bunch of rain on the island of Jamaica. All this rain funneled into Discovery Bay, and that fresh water washed out over the reef and bleached the whole reef. Well, interestingly enough, that reef completely recovered again. And that harkens back to the comment I made earlier that corals have evolved for hundreds of thousands of millions of years, right? So what that means is natural disturbance events like hurricanes, they're pretty well adapted to deal with that. What they're not well adapted to deal with are these marine heat waves, where you're getting elevated sea surface temperatures across these huge areas. So I just want to briefly go through the history of eastern tropical Pacific reefs and basically to illustrate why coral bleaching is such an existential threat to coral reefs on planet Earth. So the take-home message of this figure is basically what you're looking at is a sea surface temperature anomaly plot. So those pinks mean water much hotter than average, and then you get a gradation down. So the take-home here is during the 1982-83 and again in the 97-98 El Nino events, the Galapagos Islands experienced incredibly high thermal anomalies, as well as so did coral reefs in the Pacific side of Panama. Now, Panama experienced much less thermal stress. And again, here's our Panamanian reef. And I call this the best case scenario because this area experienced the lowest heat stress during El Nino. There was still 75 to 85% coral mortality. What that means is 75 to 85% of the corals on these reefs died during this one El Nino event. However, enough of them survived. And Postalopera is the genus of coral you see there in the background. And these are the guys that build the reefs on the Pacific side of Panama. So enough of these guys survived and they, over time they grew, they fragmented, and basically the reef started coming back, right? And coral cover, let me explain this figure so you know what I'm talking about. So here on the bottom right, you're looking at coral cover of the species on the reef. So, and this is from 1980 through to 2018, I guess. So you see the huge drop in coral cover after the 82-83 El Nino, and then it was very, very low for, a good 10, 15, 20 years. I became involved in this project in 2002. So by then the coral cover had already started rebounding, right? And the big interesting thing here is the coral cover continued to increase despite the fact that there were subsequent El Nino events. So this reef area got hit with the same amount of heat stress in 1997, 1998, as well as 2015 and 2016 that it saw in the early 80s. However, it didn't have the same response this time. So there was an acclimatization response in that these corals displayed an increased ability to withstand this heat stress. And this is due to the fact that they associate with a very heat-tolerant algal symbiont. Now, the algal symbionts that live within coral tissues are actually from 4 different genera. So there's multiple different species of algal symbiont that live in corals, and some of them are more tolerant to heat than others. So this is a mechanism by which corals can survive coral bleaching and then kind of become harder to future disturbance events. As I just said, there's less bleaching and mortality during the subsequent El Niños. I do want to point out, though, even though you see this kind of very exciting, positive response happening in Panama, there was still notable declines in other species, and there was the extinction of 2 fire corals from bleaching in 1982, 83, and 97, 98. And the other species of coral in Panama, aside from these post-eloporids, they don't show this increase in thermal tolerance, right? So you're still having very significant, long-lasting impacts from one single bleaching event, even though we can call this a best-case scenario because the reef is actually recovered. Worst-case scenario would be what happened in the Galapagos Islands. Now, even Charles Darwin, he also studied coral reefs. People don't realize that, and made some really significant progress on coral reef science. You know, his theory of atoll formation is still basically accepted today. So, you know, Darwin spent a little time in the Galapagos. You might have heard about that. You know, one of the things he wrote about was that in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, there's basically no coral reefs, right? And he hypothesized about why that is. Well, in the mid-1970s, a guy by the name of Jerry Wellington was working for the Peace Corps, and he was snorkeling around the Galapagos, and he started seeing these coral buildups. Well, him and his buddy Peter Glenn was my PhD advisor, they went out and documented these reefs. You know, it basically discovered coral reefs on the Galapagos Islands where they were not known to be found before. Now, these reefs are very, very marginal, right? Because you get very, very high environmental variability. So, you know, these are very, very small reefs. It's not like anything you would find, you know, on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. That's why Darwin didn't see them, essentially, because they're very small. And ironically, the publication describing these reefs came out in 1983. And the reason I say that's ironic is because that was the year these reefs all died and disappeared. So high heat stress from the 82, 83 El Nino killed 95 to 99% of the corals in the Galapagos Islands. And these reefs bioeroded in about 10 years' time. So what you're looking at here is that same reef from the previous slide, and there's been no recovery since 1982, 83. And basically, this is the foundation volcanic bedrock where this reef used to be. So we're talking about a complete elimination and extinction of an entire ecosystem due to one bleaching event in the Galapagos. So what have we learned from Eastern Pacific reefs? Well, the response of corals to heat stress is a function of the magnitude of the heat stress as well as how long it lasts, right? So the Galapagos provides us with the recipe for how to wipe coral reefs off planet Earth. Basically 2 to 3 degrees Celsius of warming for more than 2 months, plus 2 to 3 times atmospheric CO2. Now, I'm not going to get into this, but not only is climate change causing global warming, but we also have this problem of ocean acidification. So about 30% of all the carbon dioxide that's gone into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution has been taken up by the oceans. And this is because CO2 reacts with water, forms carbonic acid, which then dissociates to hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. So basically, as CO2 is dissolving into the oceans, it's lowering the pH. Now, the Galapagos provides a natural laboratory for future ocean acidification projections. And that's because it experiences this process called upwelling, where these deep waters are brought to the surface. Now, when these waters are in the deep ocean, they're accumulating essentially organic material. You know, it's called marine snow. So over time, you know, plankton in the surface ocean, they die and they sink. And as they sink, they're basically getting consumed by microbes. And those microbes are releasing CO2 as they consume this organic matter. So when you have upwelling in certain parts of the ocean, you're basically bringing all this CO2 enriched water to the surface. So the Galapagos provide us, like I said, the recipe for how to wipe coral reefs off the planet. And what's interesting is that the documentation of the response of these Eastern Pacific corals by my PhD advisor is ultimately what led to the primary bleaching algorithm that we use at Coral Reef Watch, which is the program I'm in charge of now. So it's pretty hilarious that, in the 1980s, my PhD advisor, I was a very young man at that point, was out documenting this stuff, and it basically led to the program that I'm now leading for NOAA. Again, so in Panama, we saw survival of corals and maintenance of reef accretion, and this was associated with those heat-tolerant algal symbionts. The issue is we don't know if this is going to continue to be applicable once you hit a reef with severe heat stress, like what we saw in Florida and the Caribbean last year. So Coral Reef Watch, why is it needed? Well, coral bleaching is now considered to be the biggest threat to the continued existence of coral reefs. Now, coral reef scientists, we don't agree about anything. We like to argue, but the one thing everyone basically agrees on is that climate change is killing corals at an unprecedented rate. We haven't seen this level of mortality on coral reefs in the geologic history, aside from mass extinction events, right? So coral reef scientists are all on the same page. In the 25 years I've been in this field, I've watched very, very prominent people go from, I don't want to say skeptics, but downplaying impacts to being the most vocal, stewards to try to get carbon dioxide pollution brought down and climate change under control. So at Coral Reef Watch, we're providing bleaching predictions so managers, scientists, and the public know when and where heat stress is happening on their reefs and when bleaching is happening, and that way they can research it, monitor it, do restoration, as well as manage local activities. So this just goes through the products at Coral Reef Watch. I don't want to bore you too much. So we're making our own sea surface temperature product. Now, when we talk about coral reefs, we're mostly interested in anomalies. And what an anomaly is basically how temperatures compare to average conditions, right? So this is just showing you how sea surface temperatures compare to average. And again, I'll get into this later, but it's basically warmer than average almost everywhere. Now for corals, thermal anomalies we're most concerned about are what we call hotspots. And again, this is just a thermal anomaly above that maximum average temperature they normally experience. So once you go 1 degree Celsius above that maximum average temperature they normally experience, that's when you're at risk for bleaching. So degree heating weeks take those hotspots and they sum them over the last 12 weeks. That provides you a metric of the duration and the magnitude of heat stress exposure. And this is the primary proxy we use to predict bleaching risk on reefs. Now, if you don't want to understand the degree heating week algorithm, it is a little bit complicated. Gong Lu developed this bleaching alert area index, which basically distills down that DHW degree heating week information into these alert levels. So that way you can just look at, where your reef is and figure out, am I in an alert level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And we also have regional virtual stations that basically summarize all this information for specific areas. So we had a new reality dawn upon us last year in the wider Caribbean. Now, before last year, Coral Reef Watch had 2 bleaching alert levels. And basically, these predicted when bleaching would happen, and they predicted when mortality would start happening. Well, by the time we got to the end of October, pretty much the same time this year we are right now, the entirety of the wider Caribbean and much of the Eastern Pacific was just this blanket of dark red. So this was an issue for 2 reasons. First, it was not reflecting just how severe the heat stress had gotten. And 2, this was giving people the wrong impression that once you hit this alert level 2, everything was going to die, which isn't true. So we added in 3 additional alert levels. Now these are based on the literature response of corals. So our bleaching alert level 5 category is basically worst case scenario. This is catastrophic impacts to corals where you see that near complete mortality. So there's been 4 examples of this level of heat stress, the Galapagos, which I just showed you, twice in Kiribati, as well as Jarvis. And in those cases, 89 to 99% of the corals on those reefs died. So again, bleaching alert level 5, that's catastrophic. And then these other bleaching alert levels are basically just the intermediaries between alert level 2 and alert level 5. Now, we should just throw out alert level 2. And the reason I say that is because you can still have really significant mortality of heat-sensitive species at these levels of heat stress, and sometimes even lower. And also when a reef experiences its first event, it's more sensitive to heat than when it experienced subsequent events. And I gave you an example of that in Panama. So again, In the Caribbean last year in 2023, large areas got hit with bleaching alert level 5, and pretty much all of the Caribbean experienced at least an alert level 4, and this was record setting. So this shows you maximum degree heating weeks since January 2023, and basically any color here that's warmer than that yellow color means bleaching level heat stress. So again, if we look at this in the this bleaching alert area space, this shows you basically the level of heat stress we've seen in the last year and a half plus, and we have confirmed that mass bleaching has taken place since February of 2023 to now in at least 73 countries and territories. What do you do when this happens? Well, in the Maldives, they completely shut down all coastal development projects for about a month. And the idea here is to try to limit any secondary stressors, right? So when you're doing coastal development, you can stir up a lot of sediment, which isn't good for corals. So they basically knew this bleaching was happening, and they said, hey, we got to shut down things for a month. In Thailand, they started closing areas to tourists, right? So in Phuket, they closed Pling Island and the surrounding areas to tourists, that way to try to, limit any secondary impacts that these corals may experience. So this just shows you the heat stress over the last year and a half relative to the entire satellite record. And this is just showing you where it's been record setting, right? So the Atlantic Ocean, basically is bearing the brunt of this event. I mean, it's seeing incredibly severe record-setting heat stress. There's also been record-setting heat stress there in the central, western, equatorial Pacific around the Samoan Islands, as well as over there north of Madagascar in the Seychelles as well. So this is the 4th global bleaching event. There's been 3 already, and this is by far the most spatially expansive. So that percent number, that is the percentage of reef areas that have experienced bleaching level heat stress within the last 365 days. So the previous record was during the 3rd global bleaching event, where that peaked at 56%. We're almost over that by 20%, and it's happened at about half the time. Similarly, if you look at the cumulative exposure of bleaching level heat stress, we're at about 77%. Again, the previous record was 65%, so we've gone about 12% over in, again, about half the time. And 99.9% of the Atlantic Ocean has seen bleaching level heat stress within the last year. So every coral in the Atlantic Ocean within the last year has basically experienced heat stress. So what does this mean? Well, we saw an 8% loss of the world's corals in 98 during the first global event, and then a further 14% loss. So this event is likely going to be the worst on record, but again, we need to collect the data and analyze the impacts before we make that statement. So 2023 saw historic Florida coral bleaching. So many Twitter X users started posting about extreme water temperatures off Florida early in July. And the international and national media took interest and began reaching out to us and said, what does this mean for the corals? And we said, unequivocally, this is an existential threat, right? Corals are going to start bleaching in a matter of days. And again, it didn't take long. Within a few weeks, within less than 2 weeks, we started hearing reports of mass mortality, corals dying in mass. Some restoration sites in Florida that they had been restoring for over 10 years completely died in a matter of days. That article there on the bottom left was on the cover of the print edition of the New York Times, because people got so desperate they started pulling corals out of the ocean because basically they couldn't survive there anymore. This just shows you what happened. So we had an acute heat shock and rapid tissue loss. So some of these corals got so much heat so fast, they didn't even have a chance to bleach. Their tissues just melted off and sloughed away because they experienced an acute heat shock. We also saw this in soft corals. The reason this was surprising is because up until now, soft corals have basically been a winner in the Caribbean. These are one of the few taxa that haven't seen a huge decline in the Caribbean in the last 50 years. Well, they also apparently have an acute heat tolerance threshold, and they basically started disintegrating within a matter of days because it got so hot in Florida last year. So this just shows you, by the end of July, the reefs, this was complete bleaching. It's unequivocal, severe bleaching. And I've circled the corals there that have already died and getting covered by the cyanobacteria that basically comes in because as the tissues decay, they're releasing all these nutrients, and these algae, basically recruit to that and take advantage of these decaying tissues. So this shows you just how hot it got in Florida last year. So the heat stress started earlier than ever before, it lasted longer than ever before, and it was record setting for 29 consecutive days. So what that means is For 29 straight days, sea surface temperatures in Florida last year were hotter than had ever been recorded in the entire satellite record. Pretty friggin' significant. So again, if you look here on the right, that plot on the top, that shows you daily average sea surface temperatures for the entire satellite record. The bottom, that shows you that accumulated heat stress, that degree heating weeks metric. And as you can see, during prior bleaching events in Florida, we topped out at an alert level 2 at about 8-degree heating weeks. Well, last year we hit an alert level 5 on many reefs in Florida. So this just shows you how widespread the impacts started. Within a matter of weeks in July, we saw mass bleaching, severe mass bleaching and mortality happening in 2 ocean basins, multiple countries. And this just shows you some examples from Florida, the Caribbean side of Panama. There are reefs on both sides of Panama. You can dive in 2 different oceans in the same day. So this shows you corals on the Caribbean side of Panama, unfortunately, bleaching and dying. And then we see one of those post-elaborate Eastern Pacific reefs down there off of Oaxaca in Mexico, bleaching in early July as well. The good news is that El Nino is ending. El Nino is usually, it's basically the warm phase of the climate oscillation. So we see these severe mass bleaching events on the backs of El Nino. So all these global coral bleaching events have happened during strong El Nino. So the fact that El Nino is over is good. That means hopefully the bleeding will stop here soon as we shift into this La Nina state. But again, we have to keep in mind that the ocean is still running a serious fever. So this is that anomaly plot. And you can see pretty much everywhere on planet Earth, except for the equatorial Central Pacific, down very, very southern French Polynesia and off the coast of South America, the ocean's hotter than average still. And we're seeing mass bleaching now pop up during all phases of ENSO. Great Barrier Reef bleached during La Nina in 2022. Usually during La Nina events, it's cooler and you don't have to worry about bleaching. Well, the oceans have gotten so hot now that we're seeing large-scale bleaching during La Nina, because basically a La Nina now is what an El Nino was 50 years ago. So again, times have changed and all right, cool. I'm glad that's over. Another very hot year in the Caribbean. This year would be record-setting if it wasn't for last year. We can see this heat stress. Pretty much all the Lesser Antilles are now sitting in an alert level 4 as we speak, and much of the rest of the Caribbean is at an alert level 3 or 2. And we've seen some unprecedented record-setting patterns again this year, unfortunately. Again, the similar plot is Florida. The gray line in these plots is 2023, which broke all records off the charts. Well, this year we're seeing record-setting patterns again. In Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, heat stress showed up 2 months earlier than ever before, and it looks like it's about to eclipse what happened last year. Again, similar thing on the Caribbean side of Panama as well as Nicaragua. So again, we're seeing record-setting heat stress patterns play out again this year. So now what? Well, the more we can learn from these events, the more we could potentially do in the future. So the only prior example of this level of heat stress for the Caribbean happened in 2005. What we found in that event was that it was the post-bleaching disease outbreak that caused the biggest impacts. So a lot of the corals survived the heat only to go on to die from disease in the next 1 to 2 years. The other thing about understanding the fate of corals when bleaching is this process of corallivery. Again, as I said earlier, many different animals eat coral tissues. Well, the issue is some of these guys take advantage of stress events. So there's these coral-eating snails that'll form aggregations on corals, either that resisted bleaching, which they saw in the Maldives, or corals that are damaged or diseased, which happens in Florida and the Caribbean. These guys, the Coralliophila, will basically form these aggregations. And the reason this happens is because there's much less coral tissue for them to eat. So they've always been there historically, right? It's just, and they would eat coral, but it wouldn't be a big deal because there was so much coral and it was growing so fast. Well, now we have less and less coral. They're aggregating on these tissues and eating these corals. So removing these guys is actually a well-known viable mechanism to save corals from bleaching. So bleaching monitoring, why do we want to do it? This is a pretty striking photo from the Indian Ocean in 2015 of a scientist monitoring bleaching. Well, we can establish taxa-specific bleaching and mortality curves. So what you're looking at here is basically a mortality curve for 2 threatened coral species in Florida. And what we find is that once you hit about 7.8 degree heating weeks, 50% of the corals are going to die. So this provides information for managers who are going to do interventions, right? We don't want to, hopefully we don't have another situation where people need to pull corals off the reef, but this is going to tell them, when they need to do it and which species are more important to do it first. Also, we need to understand is the timing of these disease outbreaks and these corallivore outbreaks, is it predictable or is it just chaos? Is it haphazard? If it's predictable, then we could potentially do something about it. Also, bleaching monitoring, you can identify refugia, heat-tolerant individuals, acclimatization, and you also need to document what's lost, right? Because if you don't know what's lost, you can't restore it. And on the Great Barrier Reef, I was talking to colleagues down there about a month ago, and they're basically establishing very good relationships between how severe corals are bleaching and their ultimate mortality. So that way, they can do bleaching surveys and estimate what the mortality might be downstream. Now, fun fact, the Great Barrier Reef, bigger than the country of Italy. So at the Australian Institute of Marine Science and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, they use helicopters and planes to do bleaching monitoring. And they use the Coral Reef Watch data products to determine when they put those helicopters and planes in the air. So we have really, really excellent partnerships with the Australians, and they're using our products quite a bit. So we're sitting in we're experiencing our 4th global bleaching event right now, and it's continuing to increase in scale, unfortunately. 73 countries and territories have had mass bleaching since February of 2023. About 77% of the world's reef areas have been impacted by bleaching level heat stress. And again, this is still increasing as we speak. These are strange days for global ocean temperatures. The top right there, you see basically daily average sea surface temperature average for the whole world. For the entire satellite record of this satellite data product. Now the orange line was 2023. As you can see, it jumped off the freaking chart of where temperatures had been previously. And then again, 2024 is this red line, and we're still way anomalous compared to anything that's ever happened prior to last year. Down there in the bottom right, that shows you daily average sea surface temperatures for the North Atlantic. Again, very, very hot. You don't need to tell anyone in Florida or North Carolina that the oceans are very, very hot because they're dealing with the impacts of a hot ocean right now and those hurricanes. The end of El Nino is good, but we still have a very, very hot ocean, unfortunately. And it's important to understand the timing of these disease and corallivore outbreaks because that could potentially give us ways to save corals in the future. And again, preventing a local extinction could be as simple as picking snails off corals. Now, the impacts from this event are going to take about 1 to 2 years to fully understand. And the reason I say that is because corals can continue to die for up to 2 years after they bleach. And that's that. I'd like to thank the Coral Reef Watch team for making me look good on a daily basis and take any questions if we still have time.
Okay, thank you so very much. Sarah, you want to begin with comments and/or questions?
Yeah, well, I was particularly interested in something that connected to something I've seen, which was I went to the Henry Dorley Zoo and got to see where they were keeping these corals, and they have a wonderful exhibit at the zoo, and they were talking about how it's like a seed bank. And I was wondering, Derek, if you could talk a little bit more, because when somebody says, "Oh, we just take the corals off the," that sounds really strange, but that's what they're actually doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's prior to last July, the idea of pulling corals off the reef to save them. I mean, nobody thought we were going to see that, right? Ever. It seems absurd, but basically what happened was, these acroporid corals, the elkhorn and the staghorn corals, their populations have collapsed in Florida. So their genetic diversity is dwindling, right? You talk about loss of biodiversity. So people were like, we need to save this genetic diversity. So they were going out and taking branches of these corals to preserve the genetic diversity and bring it into land-based nurseries, right? So they are doing this in other locations as well. In Hawaii, they have this thing called the ARC, where during bleaching in 2015 and 16, they knew it was coming because of the Coral Reef Watch products. So they went out and they knew they had very, very endangered coral species that only existed in a few places. So they brought them into the lab. the reef bleached, after a couple of years, temperatures went back down, and then they put those corals back out and saved them. So again, there's multiple types of interventions that can be done. The issue obviously is scale. This isn't easy to do. Everyone thinks coral reef scientists, we're sitting in hammocks drinking margaritas. Well, doing coral reef field work is actually really, really hard, and it's rough on your body. So, there was a Herculean effort last year to save as many corals as possible, and they did a great job. I mean, they basically preserved a lot of the genetic diversity in these corals that would have been lost. So, we've gone from a situation where large-scale restoration of reefs is ongoing, but now we're starting to creep into almost like a white rhino situation for some coral species, in that we're looking at a potential future where certain species may only ever be able to live, in aquaria or zoos at some point. I mean, I hope we don't get there, but based on what happened last year in Florida, it's like, there's been a big sea change in how we are thinking about corals and preservation, right? So again, we've gone from trying to restore ecosystems to thinking in terms of like doomsday vault seed banking, right?
And Nancy was asking, where currently are the corals that were removed?
So they put so last year in Florida, they put a lot of them back out, I think, during the winter once water temperatures cooled off, just because, if you've ever had an aquarium in your house, it's probably been a freshwater one, unless you're crazy and done saltwater, but it's not easy to keep marine animals alive on land, right? This is expensive. So most of those corals they put back out. Now, obviously they saved all that genetic diversity, those individual branches from each individual coral. But most of the corals they have ended up putting back out onto the reef once things cooled off.
Mark, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Derek. I'm not a scientist, but this is fascinating. But I'm curious, there's two things you said that, one thing you said, you talked about the countries that were stopping development, and I'm in the architecture field, so I was wondering what kind of development you're on, land development, and if so, how does that impact the water in the reef, or is it some other kind of development?
I believe it's like coastal development. So, things like in the Maldives, probably, maintaining resorts or something, or dredging channels, or building new hotels, or, stuff like that. So basically anything that would have a direct impact on the marine environment, building docks, anything that would disturb sediments and cause resuspension. In terms of building, I'm not sure of the specifics, but I'm guessing anything on land they probably were continuing to do. Again, I mean, there's not much land in the Maldives, as I'm sure you probably know. But yeah, so basically any kind of coastal project that's going to directly impact the marine environment, they just stopped it for about a month in the Maldives.
Did they notice any change?
I'm not sure. I haven't heard, to be honest. Again, I think scientists in the Maldives are probably, they're out, they're documenting the impacts of the bleaching that happened right now. So I don't know if they'll notice any change. I mean, it's likely they won't. But again, people are just trying to do any possible action that they can take, right?
Yeah. Are there any efforts to genetically modify coral reefs to resist the effects of heat?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Australian Institute of Marine Science, I think they're really the world leaders on this. They've been doing it for 15 years now, maybe something like that. So basically they are doing exactly what you're talking about. So they identified certain individuals of both coral and the symbiotic algae that are more heat tolerant. And basically they're trying to make generations of corals that are more resistant to bleaching. And these efforts are going on in Hawaii. These efforts are going on in Florida. And they've had some success, right? But the big challenge is, number one, the scale. Like I said, doing field work on reefs, it's not like mowing your lawn. It's not a very easy thing to do. So even with tons and tons of money and resources, you're only ever going to be able to restore very small, parts of a reef, right? You can't restore the entire country of Italy if that's the size of the Great Barrier Reef. And then the other big issue is it's really a resource versus scale and rate of the problem, right? So corals are slow growing, they're reproducing once a year. There's incredibly smart scientists working on this, but the rate and magnitude that climate change is happening is so much faster than we can grow corals in the lab and experiment on them and all that kind of stuff. So we really need like much higher order of magnitude investment into exactly what you're talking about, right? If we really want to make any kind of dent in what's happening. But yeah, I mean, it's ongoing, but again, there is some signs of hope, but again, it's the scale and the resources that are going into it are just, it's just a drop in the ocean, essentially.
Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry, one more quick question, Desmond, sorry. Ron, back to the development question. What do chemical runoff, like from on-land development, how does that impact the coastal waters? Like chemicals that are put on lawns and run through the streets and back into the oceans.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
from farming.
Yeah, so land-based sources of pollution can be huge, huge negative impacts on corals. It's really, really a complicated response, right? So, you can see runoff causing algal blooms in the water column. You can see it causing algal blooms on the reefs, and the reefs, themselves. More nutrients in the water can cause more disease. If you have more macroalgae on the reef and it's rubbing against corals, that can cause more disease. The issue with the land-based sources of pollution and nutrification is quantifying that it's very, very difficult to quantify that, if you can believe it or not. And there's actually been quite a lot of debate and, back and forth in the literature about the relative importance of, direct human impacts versus things like climate change. But yeah, I mean, definitely, if you have fertilizer runoff going into the oceans, it's not good for corals. In restricted environments, you can see, basically hypoxia happen. So in Biscayne Bay in Florida, some of the more restricted areas north of Miami where you don't have a lot of water exchange, they've seen big die-offs and kills because, basically you get so much algae in the water and there's more biomass than, the ecosystem can sustain, and basically all the oxygen gets stripped and then you see fish dying everywhere. So yeah, it's a huge problem. And, we really need to be reducing all these kind of direct human impacts that we can control to try to give corals the best chance, possible to deal with the fact that they're being cooked on a regular basis now.
Yeah, thank you.
So, my first question again is focused on hope and solutions. Is there any discussion about a global effort to save the corals? Like you said, it's a massive type of undertaking, but at the international level, at the global level, is there any talk or discussion of people trying to pool resources to try and, make a difference here?
So there are multiple kind of international consortia, I guess you could call them. So this thing called the International Coral Reef Initiative, and then the World Bank and the UN also put money into, coral projects to try to increase coral adaptation or restoration or things like that. So there are a lot of efforts taking place. Again, these tend to be, I mean, there is a lot of effort taking place, I should say, but the money, the magnitude of the money is very, very small relative to the problem, right? So, And like I said earlier, we really need probably 10 times as many people in the lab doing these experiments to try to genetically modify these corals, right? So, things like agriculture and growing corn in the States, we figured out how to do that really, really well, really, really fast. And that's because there was a huge profit potential, right? So a bunch of money went into it. Well, you don't really have that profit potential for coral reefs. So
Yeah.
again, there are international efforts, definitely. There are multiple, but yeah. So people are trying to do all they can. It's just very challenging when you have these global impacts you can't control.
Yeah. So the other question I have is anyone looking into the impact of sargassum seaweed? Because it sounds like they may be suffering from the same problem. I don't know what the theory about the explosion over the last decade or so of sargassum. I don't know what the theories are now about how that happened, but it seems to be coinciding with the bleaching of coral reefs too. So is anyone trying to see if there's cause and effect or at least correlation?
So sargassum, for those of you who don't know what that is, so it's a floating seaweed. It's a brown algae. It lives, basically lives its entire life floating in the water column. And again, it's a natural thing, but for whatever reason, in the last 10 years or so, in the Caribbean and Florida, the abundance and the biomass of this algae has just exploded, right?
Yep.
I mean, it is crazy to see this in person. I mean, I was in Mexico in 2019. I mean, you can't even walk on the beach because
I
there's so
know.
much hydrogen sulfide that you just feel like you're going to pass out.
Yep.
So the sargassum issue, basically, it's been linked to basically the question that came up earlier about land-based sources of pollution and nutrient inputs, right? So people think it has something to do with land clearing and deforestation in the Amazon basin and the Orinoco basin, because the Caribbean is actually, all of that is connected. So basically water that's coming out of the Orinoco River and the Amazon basin, the currents are basically pulling that and wrapping it all back up and pulling it up next to Florida and all that. So the idea is that, because of deforestation and more nutrient inputs into the water column, that basically we're fertilizing these sargassum, and now they basically exploded. And they also grow faster because the water is warmer as well, right? So there's a direct temperature relationship there. So yeah, I mean, the sargassum issue is unbelievable. I mean, all that, when you get all that sargassum coming on shore, it causes these dead zones because it causes that phenomenon where it just sucks all the oxygen out of the water, and then that decays and then releases hydrogen sulfide into the air and can really impact people with respiratory issues.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And this could be another example from what you just said about the sargassum of small island nations not causing the environmental effects, but being like plundered, impacted by the environmental effects. If this is coming from Orinoco and all of that, Amazon, because I was like, the Caribbean is, developing, but we're not developing to the point where we have all these nutrients coming off from, there is, but the scale of sargassum pollution, if you will, is really massive.
Yeah, I mean, it's really impacting economies, right? And tourism is one of the primary, drivers of economies in a lot of these places. And people don't want to go to the beach if you can't sit at the beach, right?
Right.
If you feel like you're going to vomit from smelling seaweed.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's kind of going to be one of the tragedies of this century, right? Is that the people with the least input into these global environmental catastrophes are suffering the worst, right? So small island developing states in the Pacific, like the Maldives and the Marshall Islands, that basically, sea level rise is really going to be what gets them, unfortunately. But yeah, no, I mean, it's a tragedy. I don't know how else to
So
Say it.
primarily because the brown seaweed is a floater, it doesn't really affect um the corals that much, or is it just not studied enough yet to?
I mean, if they're so the Caribbean, if the sargassum problem was happening in the Indo-Pacific, it would affect a lot more corals. And the reason I say that is because in the Caribbean, there's just basically where the sargassum comes ashore and accumulates, there aren't as many corals in that very, very near shore coastal environment in the Caribbean relative to other places like in the Indo-Pacific. And again, that has nothing to do, that's all due to geologic evolutionary history of the species and all that. So if you have really, really shallow corals, then yeah, absolutely, that will kill them immediately, right? Due to low oxygen.
Yeah, yeah. Other comments, questions? This is fascinating and very problematic because we sort of like bordering here on like hopeless, and I never want to think there is no hope. Yes, somebody has a question or comment?
Yeah. Recently or a few years ago, there was this phenomenon of red tide. Is that related to any of this?
So red tide, what's interesting is the algae that cause red tide are actually related to the symbionts that live in corals. So these are all things called dinoflagellate algae. So the red tide problem, it's somewhat related to elevated temperatures. So those algal populations are stimulated by higher water temperatures. It has a lot to do with sediment resuspension, essentially. So now that Hurricane, God, I can't even keep track of the names anymore. Hurricane Milton came through Florida. I bet you they're going to see a bunch of red tide on the west coast there around Tampa, because basically these guys, the way they reproduce, there's like these little, I think they're like cysts that sit in the sand, and then for whatever reason they get stirred up, they cause these red tide outbreaks. So yeah, I mean, the red tide problem is not super well understood, I don't think, but again, it definitely has linkages to elevated temperatures and nutrient pollution.
So do you have connections with, there are at least two groups in Trinidad and Tobago, Reef, Reef, I'm forgetting the rest of their name, but it's a organization there in Tobago. And then there's another one where the acronym is ERIC. They are based in Charlottesville, Tobago. Reef, as the name suggests, is in Reef, Buku in Tobago. Do you have connections with any of those types of groups or individuals?
We do communicate with at least one or two scientists down in Trinidad and Tobago. I honestly can't tell you. I don't remember off the top of my head where they work. I thought they worked for the government, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, there is a government organization too related to this. I'll send you offline. I'll send you some names of organizations and persons, because I know they'll be very interested in whatever type of collaborations and stuff.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things we're working on now is we're working on documenting the impacts of this event. So we're basically engaging with collaborators all over the world to get data on bleaching and mortality, right? To understand what the ramifications of this event really, really are. So, the more contacts we have, the better.
Yeah. Nancy, I see you have, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
I think Derek's kind of covered some of those questions in some of the conversation he was having between you and Mark. Thank you, Derek. This was terrifying and really
I know.
As Desmond was saying, I mean, climate change becomes this thing, right? Where it's so big and it's hard for people to wrap their minds around it, because how can they make an impact? What can they do, right? So maybe a takeaway, what is something that everyone who's attending today can do as a small step that help with this besides putting ice in the ocean to cool
Good
it?
question. Good question. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is I feel like we're well past the time where there needs to be a conversation, at the highest levels of government. It's just the nonsense has to stop. And, we're all dealing with these impacts, right? It's not a Republican or Democrat problem anymore, right? I mean, there's a lot of Republicans in Florida that are dealing with a hell of a lot of issues right now from Hurricane Milton.
Yeah.
And that's directly fueled by hot ocean temperatures. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, being stewards for coral reefs, the more awareness that's out there that we're losing these precious habitats that exist like nowhere, and they're not going to be coming back anytime soon if these mortality events continue. And yeah, I mean, I guess communicating with representatives, voting on issues that will have any kind of positive impacts on this. But yeah, I mean, it is very, very challenging. So, we do need to be reducing any kind of secondary impacts to corals that we can, right? So better, sewage management, things like that. Those, that can all negatively impact corals. So overfishing can impact corals.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's an awareness issue at this point. And I think the more and more people that are aware and communicating and understanding what's happening, my hope is that eventually this is going to trickle up and make politicians finally respond, right? That's my hope. I do want to say, it is doom and gloom, but we also need to understand that we don't 100% know exactly what's going to happen. We know some species of coral are just drop dead immediately, right? But reefs are changing, and they're going to continue to change because of this. And basically what we're going to see is a shift to very, very stress tolerant corals. We've already seen that in a lot of places. It's what's happening right now. So reefs are just going to look very, very different and function very, very different moving forward. And, I don't think corals are going to be completely eliminated everywhere. I think some species are going to be able to cope with this. We saw this in Florida last year. So in Florida, the elkhorn and the staghorn corals, I mean, catastrophic mortality. I mean, complete extirpation of those corals from the Florida Keys, local extinction. They're gone from last year. However, the massive and boulder corals, the ones that, build those massive and boulder morphologies, they actually showed pretty decent survivorship last year. So, there are nuggets of hope in here. So, I think it's important that we don't give up. We continue trying to restore and do everything we can. I would love to see way more investment in the science behind this assisted evolution approach, because I do think there's promise there. But yeah, I mean, it comes down to enacting global change. The question is, how do we do that? And that's a hard one to answer.
I know. All right. If there are no more questions or comments, we want to thank Derek. This was really good, very informative. Even though, the prognosis isn't good, hopefully, one of the things about our species, humans, is our resilience. And hopefully we could bring that to many of the problems we have and don't become hopeless about them. Yeah, so, well, thank you again, Derek. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to everyone that joined us today. And we'll be back here next week. Next week, we will be looking at Future Farm by Art and Michael. So thanks again. Have a great weekend. If it's Friday, it's environmental. Fridays, it is personal. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Desmond.
Thank you.
So I need to talk to you and Nancy offline.
Absolutely. I'll send an email and copy Nancy in so that we can get connected.
Okay, sounds good. Right. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, Nancy.
Thank
Thank you.
Nancy.
It was great. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Nancy, you
And
need
nice
to be
job
a
moderating.
regular too. You need to be a regular.
I told her you're looking for more co-hosts. So
That's right. I do need another two more co-hosts for this season. I'll
Okay,
send you the updates. Yeah.
wonderful.
Yes.
So it's
Take,
very productive Friday.
there you go.
yes.
That's right.
Yes, that's right. All right.
Okay.
Take
Have a great day.
take care.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.